Hey there, folks. I'm coming to you from my home office today. Decided to change up just the way we're doing this a little bit today and try and be a little bit more conversational. And part of the fun of that is that my neighbors happen to be having a birthday party just outside. So if at any point you hear celebratory music, that's what that is. That's just going to be our background music for today and for our message today. So I hope that you had a good week, and whether you did or you didn't, and right now, I mean, the reality of this year is that there's a lot of weeks that are just hard. They're just a slog to get through. But whatever kind of week that you had this week, my prayer for you today is that you might, today and in the coming days, believe and experience the depth of God's incredible love for you, and that you might breathe deeply of His grace. To that end, let's open with prayer. God, I pray that in these moments you would reach into all of our hearts, that we would sense your love for us, your kindness towards us, your welcome of us, and that as we experience that, that may give us the ability to read your scriptures and read this book of Revelation through the right lens, that we might see you through it and we might see truly as we read. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'd love to start today just by reviewing some of our interpretive principles of Revelation. So if you've been journeying with us since last fall through Revelation, some of this will be reviewed, but it's something that I need reminded of on a regular basis. And I thought it would probably help most people to just be reminded of, here's the lens that we're intentionally bringing to this text to help us understand what I believe God wants us to understand from the Bible here. So first, our first principle is that Revelation is not so much a roadmap to what will happen in the physical world, that's how people often read it, as it is a revelation of what's already happening in the spiritual world. Let me say that again. It's not so much a roadmap of what will happen in the physical world as it is a revelation of what's already happening in the spiritual world. Revelation is not really concerned about predicting the future, and that's one of the big problems that we run into, particularly in American Christianity, is that for about 150 years, pastors and preachers have been saying that Revelation is all about the future. And so we've all grown up hearing that message. And even if you didn't grow up in church, you probably got that impression from the people that you did hear talk about the book of Revelation. And so it's very natural for us when we open up this book to think, this is about the future. And then we try and take the symbols and make them match up to things that we see in our world. Unfortunately, that often leads to fear, and it leads to maybe too much concern with details that are not core to what God is actually trying to communicate through the book. A better lens, and what fits with the genre that Revelation was written in, how they would have understood it in the first century, the idea of apocalypse, it just means revealing. And so the point of Revelation is not predicting the future as much as is pulling back the curtain and showing us what's happening in the spiritual world, using images and symbols so that we might understand God's priority in our world as it is today. So that's the first principle. The second principle is that these visions that make up Revelation are meant to be understood literarily, not literally. Another big mistake that a lot of people make when they read Revelation is they try and make it too literal. But that's not how this genre works. It's not how it's meant to be understood. How it's meant to be understood is more similar to a political cartoon that you look at and you recognize it's showing symbolically things that everyone would understand. So our goal is to understand how the original audience would have interpreted the symbols, what they would have thought that they were relating to, and then draw meaning from there. So Revelation describes in vivid detail symbolic representations of things, not the things in themselves. So whenever you read something that seems really horrific in the book of Revelation, it's good to remind yourself, this is not something that is actually happening or will actually happen. It's a symbolic description. And so sometimes, and this is the third point, John uses strong language and strong images, not because these are things that are happening, but because it's a way to get the reader's attention and wake them up from their spiritual slumber so that they get the meaning that the symbols are supposed to represent. So John's goal is to get Christians to choose Christ over Caesar. That's why this book was written. And his main point coming into these final chapters is just to show that Caesar, or Rome, or Babylon as it becomes called in this section, is inferior to Christ, and to show that only one deserves our allegiance and that Christ is the clear right choice. So in a minute we're going to get into going through the text verse by verse. That's going to be the best way to handle this chapter 17. But before we do that, I need to make an important note about misogyny and violence against women, because Revelation chapter 17 is a really problematic text on that front. The basic plot of the text is that John uses the image of a prostitute as a symbol for Rome. And then he describes her in just really horrible terms, trying to get the reader to absolutely hate this person. And then by the end of this story, he describes her being stripped and beaten and burned and eaten. It is, I believe, intentionally disturbing, but it's also something that should make us uncomfortable as people. And I'm going to be honest, I don't have an answer for why this is here. In a very human level, I kind of wish that this text wasn't in the Bible, that John had used something else, but it is there, and so we're going to try and deal with it on its own terms. So one thing that's worth remembering, as I mentioned before, this is describing a symbol. And so John is not actually saying that a woman is going to be beaten and tortured and that God is going to look on approvingly of this. So that is one defense that can be made. But I do think that even using this image is deeply problematic. And rather than me use my own words, which are going to be really fumbling, I really appreciated the language that Brian Blount used in his commentary on Revelation. So this is what he says about this text, and this is just what I'm going to leave us with to wrestle with, because I think sometimes it's really good just for us to wrestle, not necessarily having the answer, but to actually just try and work through it. So he writes, "The problem with the whore imagery is that as it strikes out at Rome, it disparages women. In Revelation, the patriarchal mean streak implicit in ancient Israel and John's contemporary Christian whore metaphors becomes a misogynistic fault line capable of devouring the self-image of any woman thrown up against it. It's not just the use of the whore image that is problematic, since in this case, John uses that image to attack not women, but Rome. The problem is that his use of the image privileges a male perspective on the divine and matters of human redemption in relationship to the divine. The root of evil takes on an unmistakable feminine stamp. The luscious lure of feminine sex, an image of Roman cultic and economic power, seduces the righteous male, representing the people of God, into destruction. Men, the implicit symbolic referent for the people of God, may well ally with the whore, but they are presented as victims who, unlike the woman herself, are capable of redemption if they can find it within their power to resist her. It is the female hooker, not the male Johns, who is the root of the problem. The presentation allows male perspective and image, even when chastised, far less culpability. Femininity, metaphorically speaking, is problematized at its best and demonized at its worst. Evil takes on a decidedly female shape. Sexuality is the problem, and clearly for John here, it has a female orientation. And then a paragraph later he says, "There ought to be a way to target the evil of empire without exposing women to such rhetorical and potentially real collateral damage." And I really agree with that final statement that he makes. I think that the problems he mentions are all very real ones that I think we need to sit with and wrestle with. And what does it mean that the Bible includes this image that can be used that is so demeaning towards women and so problematic in its hinting at the approval of violence against women. And I just, that final sentence I'll read again. "There ought to be a way to target the evil of empire without exposing women to such rhetorical and potentially real collateral damage. So with that, we're going to move on. We're going to take the text on its own terms, but I didn't feel that it was right to study this text without dealing with that first. We need to recognize that real problem in this text and keep that in the back of our minds even as we read this. So if you've got a Bible, I encourage you to follow along and make notes and write, but we are going to open up to Revelation chapter 17. And I'm going to take this in sections. So starting at verse 1, it says, "One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries.' Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names, and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who poured testimony to Jesus." So let's look at the symbols that are here. So first, we're introduced to this scene by one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls. So if you remember from last week, we had this vision of the bowls of God's wrath being poured out on the earth as a judgment against Rome, against Babylon, against the structures and systems of empire that oppress people. And so one of those 7 angels becomes the host for the next stage of the symbolic journey. And he says to John, "I'm going to show you the punishment of the great prostitute." And so we're introduced to this woman. And this woman is, as we'll see throughout the text, there's several references that would have made it clear to any of the original readers that this woman is representing the city of Rome and its symbolic place as the center of Roman power and authority. And so everything that happens to her, everything that she does, we need to read and go, oh, this is talking about Rome, not about a literal woman. It says that she's seated by many waters or upon many waters. And these many waters get brought up again later in the passage. And they're just referring to all of the nations that are seduced by the economic prosperity of the empire. And so they come and they become allies or they become vassal states to Rome. And so that's just describing how so much of the world, when an empire arises, want to be part of the riches. They want to be part of the trade. They want to be made rich. And the empire always promises these things. It's what makes the empire seductive. Verse 3 says that she's sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, if you've been following along with us, you might recognize this beast. It was introduced in chapter 13, along with another beast. And these 2 beasts, back in Revelation 13, represented the political and military might of Rome. That's the first beast and the one that she's riding on. And another represented the religious patriotism, the imperial cult, that combined worship of God with worship of the state, and declared allegiance to the state as a religious matter, and went around as a prophet getting followers for the first beast. And in those chapters, we were told that both beasts are, they're empowered by the dragon. They're sent by the dragon who represents the devil. So what we're meant to see when we read this text is that this woman is riding on the beast of imperial power, military might, political power, which is given its power by Satan itself. So we should be recognizing this is the bad guys, right? These are the people you don't want to be like, and so it's very problematic. So those are the first things. I also want to point out she is described in very economic terms with glittering precious stones and gold and pearls, and that's just pointing to the fact that what normally seduces people to love the empire and to serve the empire and to choose the empire over Christ, in the case of Christians, is the fact that they have something to gain from it. And usually that gain is economic. It's going to privilege them. It's going to give them something. It's not like people just go, oh, I feel like going out and worshiping the beast today. No, they're going to get something from it. And usually it's going to be tied to money. And verse 6 says that she's drunk with the blood of God's holy people. And the reality we've seen throughout Revelation is that empires always have blood on their hands. You don't build an empire without building it on the backs of somebody else. And in this case, it's especially true that Rome had been the source of martyrdom for a number of Christians who decided that they were going to be faithful witnesses to Jesus. They were not going to take part in the violence and the economic disparity and all of the things that Rome wanted them to do. And so they decided to non-violently resist, and a number of them wound up giving their lives for that cause. And so John brings that up. Picking up in the second half of verse 6. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. And then the angel said to me, why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that she rides, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. So, these verses, among a book that is filled with really difficult and confusing passages, these rank up there among the very most confusing verses in all of Revelation. And the sad reality of it is people have been working for 2 millennia to find out exactly what it's referring to when it talks about 5 kings and then 7 kings, and they try and match up each of the kings to a Roman emperor, and then figure out who the 10 kings are that follow afterwards. And the unfortunate reality is nobody has an answer. Nobody has made a case that fully makes sense. You have to fudge the math with any answer that's out there, and there are so many answers out there that I've read this week. What I think is important in reading a text like this that is confusing and may just be a mystery, we may not be meant to know exactly all the reference. Some of that may just be lost to time. What's important is if you remember the principles with which we're reading Revelation of these aren't literal things, and it's not predicting the future of what will happen as spiritual realities behind that. And so if we look at this symbolically, I think we do find something that's helpful. And one is the idea that having 7 heads and 10 horns, if we understand those numbers symbolically, which most of the numbers in Revelation are meant symbolically, 7 and 10 are both generally used to symbolize completeness. Horns are used to symbolize power. So we're seeing a reference to the complete power that is a parody of God's power, but the seemingly complete and total power that Rome is exercising over the world, and that its political might and military might, that there were no armies that were going to be able to fight against Rome. And so even if we don't understand like the specific kings it refers to, I think the general image of Rome exercising power over the world is very easy to see. The other things that are clear in this passage, and when some things are clear and some things are unclear, it's best to focus on what's clear, is that the world is going to be amazed by the empire, and then they're going to be astonished when it goes to its ruin. And I think that we see that reality every time an empire has existed in the world. And that people at first are like, wow, look at this empire. Look how powerful they are. Could it ever fall? It's going to be eternal. And then every time the empire falls. Every single time. And why does it fall? Well, 14 gives us the most clear part of these verses and the most important part of these verses, which says they, the kingdoms, the empires, will wage war against the Lamb, who is Christ, but the Lamb will triumph over them. Why? Because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. So once again, John is saying, if you want to be on the winning side, if you want to be part of a kingdom that will not fail, choose Christ and Christ alone. Which takes us to the closing verses of this passage, and truly the most disturbing, but also the ones in which I believe we're meant to find hope. Starting at verse 15, it says, "Then the angel said to me, 'The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth.'" So what is this saying? Well, one, it's painting a terrible picture of violence against women. But underneath that, and in the end, the message that we're supposed to get from this is the astonishing revelation that after working together all of this time, and throughout this whole text and throughout the whole book up to this point, the idea that Rome is working with the military has just been assumed. They are together. Rome is united against Christ. But what this verse reveals, what these couple verses reveal, is that the beast, the Antichrist, the political and military might of Rome, is going to turn against Rome itself. And the waters that represent all the peoples who've been wooed by Rome's economic might, those who are wooed by the empire's promise of prosperity, eventually are going to turn on the empire itself. And the empire will tear itself apart from within. And it's this new revelation that we haven't seen yet, that's been hinted at throughout the book, as it has described these symbolic judgments upon the empire. Over and over, we've seen this proclamation that God is going to judge the empire, and he's going to destroy the empire. He's going to annihilate the systems and structures that have been used to oppress people for thousands and thousands of years. But here, it is revealed to us that one of the ways that the empire is going to be judged and destroyed is it's going to tear itself apart from within. It's going to hate itself. And this is the reality that we see over and over in history, is every empire has fallen, and almost every empire has fallen from within, when the lust for power and the Babylonian ideals of selfishness and gaining economic prosperity by pushing others down and standing on others' shoulders, these values don't work in the long run. The only values that work for a society in the long run are those values that are proposed by Christ, of self-sacrifice, of love, of caring more about the other than you do for yourself, of loving your neighbor, of loving God. These are the only ways that society flourishes. And so we see that every time a society or empire or structure moves away from the ideals of God, it falls and it eats itself from within. So one of the important questions that I've been asking every week in our small group questions, in our reflection questions after each sermon, is where do you find encouragement in this text? And the reason I ask that is that sometimes, and especially with a book like Revelation, it's a little more difficult to walk away from reading it feeling encouraged. So we need to be told to look for the encouragement, and I need to be told that myself. And so I've been trying to focus on what's going to be encouraging in this text. And for me, as I read this, and for me as we talk about these ideas, the place I feel encouragement is very much related to just the situation that we're in this year in 2020. And not that 2020 is special. I'm not thinking that, oh, as soon as we get to January, everything's going to be good. No, we have systemic issues that are going on in our world, and they're going to keep going on. But the reality is that this year, more than any year I've experienced, often feels like the world is coming apart at the seams. And maybe you felt that with me. I've certainly had many days where it just feels like the world's just, it's going to fall apart. And where I find encouragement in this text and in this book, and repeatedly throughout this study, I've kept coming back to this, is that Revelation suggests that the world coming apart might not actually be the end of the world. The world coming apart might not actually be the end of the world, but might just be part of the process that is leading toward the redemption of all things. See, the story of Revelation is the story of God bringing redemption. And so everything that we've read, all these, the plagues, the symbols of plagues, the symbols of destruction, the symbols of empires falling and rising and falling, all of that is to be seen as steps along the journey to God redeeming all things. And so I don't want to say that any specific thing that's happened is God coming in and making these things happen. I don't know the mind of God that well, and I think it's dangerous to speculate too much. But for me, just having that perspective of nothing that happens can derail God's plan for the redemption of all things is a place where I find great encouragement right now. There are many things that might be Babylon for any one of us right now, whether it's a political party or a nation or any sort of allegiances we have. Even social media apps could be a Babylon. Anything that makes the promises of, I'm going to give you what you need. I'm going to give you what you want. I'm going to make you healthy. I'm going to make you happy. I'm going to make you whole. The problem is that when it's anything other than Jesus, those are empty promises. And this is what John keeps coming back to. He says, choose Christ. Don't choose all these other things, because all these other things, they will fail. They will fall. Nothing else is eternal but Christ. And so put your trust there, because truthfully, Jesus, God, is the only one who's able to give us what we need, who's able to fulfill all of those promises, to make us healthy, to make us whole. He's the only one capable. So my invitation to you today is to trust God. And when you read a disturbing passage like the one we read today, look in it for those beacons of hope and that invitation to once again put your trust in Jesus, who loves you, who welcomes you, who is committed to your well-being. I hope that this encourages you, and I hope that you have a wonderful week, living and breathing in the grace and love of God. We'll see you next Sunday.